What's up, everybody? Ken Rita here, and welcome to Tech Freelancer. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the differences between web designers and web developers. Now, I'm going to save you some time and just give you the 1 to 2 sentence description of each of these disciplines. A web designer is predominantly focused on the look and feel of a website. They typically use design software such as Figma, Photoshop, or Sketch to create high-fidelity prototype mock-ups of the entire website. They focus on things like look and feel, aesthetics, and marketing, and don't usually deal with code themselves. A developer, by contrast, as you might suspect, deals with almost nothing but code. They are tasked with taking the completed design from the designer and then converting it into a functional and usable website. They typically focus on things like mobile optimization, speed and security, website performance, and general compatibility and usability. Now, although it's true that most web designers are expected to know a little bit of development, typically HTML and CSS to do some light changes to a website, or developers themselves also expected to know some basic design so they can likewise make updates to a site without distracting or ruining the brand image, there are very concrete differences between the two disciplines, the broad strokes of which I outlined at the top of this video. We're going to dive into the training, the tools, and the temperament that each of these disciplines have, so you can see the difference between the two and see which one you might gravitate more towards, or if you like both. So let's dive in. So first, let's talk about web designers. The tools of a web designer. The basic fundamental tools of a web designer are typically going to be the software that web designer uses. The design software specifically. Some of the most popular design softwares include Photoshop, Figma, and Sketch, for web design specifically. The Adobe Creative Cloud, of which Photoshop is a part of, has a number of other software applications you can use, such as Illustrator, such as InDesign, to touch on the different aspects of graphic design in general that may come into play when designing a website. But typically, just to get started, you're good with Photoshop or Sketch. Some of the other things you're going to need are prototyping software and wireframing tools. You can use the same tools if you want. Some people like to use whiteboards. Some people will use Google Docs. When you're designing a website, it's not just the one canvas that you have. You're typically going to be thinking of things in multi-steps and multi-phases and stages, and you'll usually sketch things out in what is called a wireframe. Some people will use Photoshop, Figma, the main tool that they're using to design the website, to also create their wireframes. Some people might want to use something else. But just know that designers will typically have a number of software applications that they use or web apps that they use, such as Google Docs or Mira, whiteboarding software, to kind of think out the design, think out the layout, if that hasn't already been done for them before they even get to the process of going to the design software. Other things they're going to want to have as far as tools in their handbag: places for inspiration, something called a swipe file. You'll find this in marketing. You'll find this in design. It's essentially a little grab bag, a little folder that you're going to keep when you go online and you see sites that you think look good, that stand out to you, or perhaps you just got a job at an agency that focuses on a specific industry or niche. Maybe they focus on lawyers or contractors or something of that nature. You find some of the best looking websites, the most modern websites, and you put them into your swipe file. Next time you know that you need to design a website, you have that as an inspirational resource. There's other things that are similar to that, such as CodePen. That's more of a developer sort of thing, but essentially you want to also have a place to go for resources. Other things that you'll use as tools as a web designer, just time-saving things, little plugins here and there. You're going to need to know fonts, so it can be nice to have little, Chrome extensions that'll easily show you the fonts. You can also do that, just by looking at the source code or you're looking at Chrome Inspect. But just for the ergonomic usability of it, it is nice to sometimes have these Chrome extensions that do help designers. So I've noticed that is a nice tool in the toolkit when you're working on design. In general, if you're working on web design, you might be part of an agency or you might be working for a business. It is good to have some sort of workflow tools, some sort of project management software. So that's also going to fall into that tool category. The temperament. You're going to want to be somebody who is creative. Not that that's not obvious, but you're going to be somebody who likes to always improve on their last design, somebody that thrives on creativity, but somebody who also knows how to keep their ego in check and be creative when they need to, and also meet the needs when they need to, and find that nice sweet spot in between. Being a designer, a web designer specifically, is something that is a bit of a mental game, because you can feel defeated when you're first starting out. If you don't know how to talk to a client, if you don't know how to get feedback, if you don't know how to work with a client to make them feel invested, or an employer to feel invested in your design, it can get a little jarring on your ego. So you have to have the kind of temperament that knows how to deal with that knows how to process feedback, that knows how to take criticism or creative direction from your creative director, from your employer, senior designer, yourself, whatever the case may be. And that's something to keep in mind with the temperament. You're also going to want to know a little bit about marketing. Not that developers don't need to know about marketing, but it is helpful as a designer, being the person who is in charge with actually setting out the layout of the website. Perhaps you already got the wireframe sent to you. Perhaps you didn't. Perhaps you need to make the wireframe. You want to know some basic marketing principles so you're not just randomly putting stuff onto a website. There are things that you would do for a doctor's website that you wouldn't do for a software website. These are things that you kind of want to know as a designer because, again, you're building the layout. All right, so now let's talk about the training involved with becoming a web designer. What sort of things can you do to become a web designer? Well, web design is not something that I would consider a subsect of graphic design or above graphic design. It's just highly related to it, in that there are many things in graphic design that are directly applicable and prerequisites to web design. Just the same, there are things that don't fully apply to web design, such as business card creation or print design, that will nonetheless give you the skills you need to be a very highly competent web designer. So to get started, I would say get a mastery of graphic design. And to do that, we learn by doing. So do things like create logos, business cards. Also study typeface. Study the way that fonts look in magazines, on websites, in really amazing designs. Get to know that really well. That's going to be a big part of being a web designer. Study marketing. Study the rule of thirds, photography. In general, just make as many beautiful things as you can using these pieces of software, and then actually get to creating the websites. All right, so now let's talk about the tools, temperament, and training needed to become a web developer. So as far as tools, the main tool that a web developer is going to use is their code editor. These can be things such as VS Code, Sublime Text, Atom is another one, but whatever you're most comfortable with, this is going to be somewhere that you're essentially going to live. This is your equivalent, in my opinion, to the design software, whether it's Photoshop or Figma. Your choice of code editor is not as strict as it might be with with graphic design software, because graphic design software has with it kind of the compatibility rub, meaning that if you work in Photoshop, you're going to have to use things that are compatible with Photoshop. You're going to have to use a developer that knows how to operate with PSD files or Photoshop files. Or maybe they prefer Figma, so you're going to need to know Figma. Whereas you can kind of switch between any code editor. They all use the same type of files because they're building websites, but the code editor itself is kind of agnostic, meaning you're going to be using a code editor to edit things like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, PHP, things of that nature, but you could start off a project with one code editor, and then you could switch code editors halfway. You might have to plug some things in here or there, but more or less it would be exactly the same setup. You really couldn't do that with all graphic design software. You can do it with some. There is cross-compatibility between Sketch and Figma in certain ways, but Photoshop and Figma, there is a conversion process that needs to happen. It's a manual process. So just bear in mind that although the code editor is, in my opinion, the equivalent to the design software, it is nice that it is a little agnostic and you can switch on the fly if you like. I personally prefer VS Code, but there's a lot of them out there. So try the ones you like. Just bear in mind, you're not going to be able to get away with just using a notepad file. You can't just use, and especially not a rich text note file. You can use notepad files for little clippets and snippets of little text and whatnot. I love doing that, but you want a code editor. So that's the main first tool that you're going to have as a web developer. After that, you're going to also want some sort of development environment, something that can run a server. This is because certain things like PHP, for example, which is the backbone of WordPress, which runs about a third or a half, at least a third of the internet. I'm fairly certain at this point. It might fluctuate. They need a server to run. They're not just going to run if you're offline, if you just load up the files in Chrome. So some sort of server is going to be another necessary tool for a web developer. They use things like MAMP, M-A-M-P, or I think it's XAMP, XAMPP, however it's pronounced, but that's the Windows equivalent, to simulate a server on your system so you can have what's called a local environment, and you can actually build this whole website. You can start coding it without actually having to go online. You emulate a server that way. Likewise, you can also use a server online in what's called a staging environment or a dev environment, and this can technically be online, but it can be in a hidden link, or it can be password protected. It's somewhere that isn't visible to Google or to outsiders. The temperament of a developer. I would say probably the biggest thing you want to be as a developer is somebody who enjoys solving problems. That is probably one of the biggest things. Somebody who's going to be meticulous, but then also patient enough to find out why something isn't working if it's not working. You can reverse engineer things. You can look at the code and figure out why. It almost as a mystery, almost as like a whodunit, or whatever is most whatever is most engaging to you. I would say a passion for problem solving is probably one of the big prerequisites. Development is nice temperament-wise because there is something of an objective nature. So either it's coded or it's not, I guess I should say. Whereas a design, you're kind of at the mercy, to a certain extent, of the client's needs, the employer's needs, whatever subjective feelings they have about the design. With development, you kind of have the luxury that it is a more mathematical process. It's kind of, honestly, when you're creating a developed website based off a design, it's really just data entry on an X and Y axis. It's how interestingly do you want to do that? How efficiently do you want to do that? How can you implement maybe something creative that a designer did? Maybe a designer created something that they haven't done on previous sites that you've worked together on. And it's going to take maybe a little bit of JavaScript or some fancy like CSS code pen type thing to bring that to life. You need to have the temperament and the patience to be a problem solver and say, how can I actualize this developed website in the highest quality, most mobile responsive way possible, and also bring to life these little interesting things they want to add. So someone who doesn't get frustrated easily, or someone who has patience but also is methodical, would be the temperament I would recommend. As far as the training, you're going to want to know code, obviously. For web design, I would say the very basics are HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and PHP. I don't see PHP always included in that list. I say it because it is the backbone of WordPress, which is a major content management system that most websites around the world use. But HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are very fundamental. PHP as well, I would recommend, especially if you're using WordPress. There are other bits of code, there are other programming languages, other specific things people use, React and different, offshoots of JavaScript, things like that. But in general, you'll be fine if you just master those to start with. And then as needed, you can start adding to your skill set with more coding knowledge. Going through things like Stack Overflow, getting little bits of advice to create, maybe forums or doing a project or doing something like, how do you create a very simple e-commerce system? How would you create a membership website? How would you create a user dashboard? Give yourself these tasks and these projects and work through them. They don't need to be pretty. It can be very ugly radio buttons because you're not focusing on the design right now. You're focusing on the functionality. So part of your training is going to be using that coding that you learned to create functional things that can then be implemented in an actual practical functional sense on the internet, combined with the design that either you do or a designer does for you.
And so there you have it. Those are some of the primary differences between web designers and web developers. So let's do a quick recap. The tools of a web designer include graphic design software such as Photoshop, Figma, or Sketch, wireframing software, a swipe file, and productivity software such as Trello, Asana, or G Suite. The temperament includes being open to feedback and criticism, having an interest in marketing, and obviously being creative. And the training includes things such as mastering graphic design by creating logos, banners, ad creative, things of that nature, as well as creating derivations of the items you put into your swipe file. Likewise, the tools of a web developer include code editors such as VS Code, Sublime, or Atom, and productivity software such as Trello, Asana, and so forth. The temperament includes being a problem solver, patient, and methodical, and the training includes creating simple web apps such as forms or membership areas, or converting design files into functional mobile responsive websites. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.